We'll get started in about a minute or two. So if you could have a seat. Okay, welcome back, everybody. I hope you had a great lunch, had some good conversation, and are refueled for a great afternoon. We're actually going to get started. So if you could have a seat. And we have a great panel on climate. So looking at climate risks, both to workers, to business. It's actually the first time that we're highlighting climate in such a way at the Global Forum. It's really an emerging piece of work that IHRB is working on that we'll be telling you a little bit about a bit later and tomorrow. So I'm going to call up our panel to come join us, and then we'll get started. So if I could have everyone's attention, if you could sit back down, we're about to get started and we'd love your attention. We have a great lineup of speakers, some very important points that will be made. And as I mentioned, the reason that we're highlighting climate is because we know that climate is having such a big effect on whether people can stay in their homes, whether farming can still provide enough to live on, and whether work is safe in rising heat. And we know that it isn't, and we've been hearing a lot about heat stress, especially in the past few weeks all over the world, and what that does to workers. And that risk doesn't always stop climate risk doesn't always stop when someone leaves their home. Similarly to conflict, workers can be pushed out by climate pressures and then arrive in jobs that are also climate exposed, especially in agriculture, logistics, construction, transport. And so at IHRB, we feel that it's a very important issue. It's not just a responsible business issue, it's also a responsible recruitment issue. Are workers recruited with clear information? Do companies know where their workers are coming from? What climate risks they're facing? What climate risks they're going into? And today we really want to ask what climate is already changing about labor migration. What do companies and recruiters need to anticipate? What are the gaps? What are some of the opportunities? And how responsible recruitment needs to adapt to these pressures now. But I don't want to start with this, jargony and policy language. I actually want to start with lived experience today. And that's why I'd like to invite Evans Kioko, who's joining us online from Nairobi, Kenya. Thank you, Evans. Evans grew up as a smallholder farmer. I'll let him introduce himself in Makueni, which is in the eastern part of Kenya. And he's joining us today to tell us a bit about his story of climate migration. Thank you, Evans, and a warm welcome.
Thank you, Sarah. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a good morning here in Nairobi. And it's my pleasure to share my story on this global forum. My name is Evans Wambua. I grew up in a small village called Mwambani in Makueni County. This is a semi-arid region in eastern part of Kenya. Growing up, agriculture seemed to work for my community. It was how families earned a living, paid school fees, and put food on the table. In fact, my passion for agriculture was so strong that my nickname became the farmer. Even up to date, some of my friends still call me that. I worked so hard in school and I was fortunate to study a degree in agriculture and enterprise development. And like other young people in my community, I believed agriculture would be my future. My dream was to become an agripreneur and build a successful livelihood through farming. After graduating, I returned back home to put my education into practice. With the support of my mother, I took out a loan of 50,000 Kenyan shillings, which this is about 400 US dollars, from a local microfinance institution. Then I went ahead and leased 5 acres of land, planted green grams, bought all the inputs and paid for labor. I believe I was doing everything right. I had the education, the plan, and the determination to succeed. Then the rains never came. The rains came for about a week or two and then stopped completely. We waited, we hoped, and the rain never returned. The green grams failed and all the investment was lost. What made it even more painful, it was that we had to repay the loan. To do that, my family had to sell livestock. I remember sitting with that reality and thinking, if someone like me, who has the training, the passion, and family support could not make farming work, what future was there for young people like me? After some time, at the same time, I struggled now to find a stable employment, whether on large farms, in agribusinesses, or in other development organizations. There were very few opportunities to use the skills I had acquired in learning. The pressure kept building, and eventually it started affecting my young family. My partner left for Dubai in search of work and better opportunities. We had a young daughter, and suddenly my family was living apart. After a few months later, I made the hard decision to follow her. I was not living because I wanted to live abroad. I was living because I wanted to save my family. I wanted to create a secure future for us. Looking back, my migration journey was not driven by the opportunity alone. It was shaped by failed family livelihood, limited job opportunities, and the reality that stay no longer seemed an option for me. However, Dubai opened my eyes to the wider world. I gained valuable skills, experience, networks that shaped who I am today. I have worked in a management consultancy and later in climate-related roles. Those experiences gave me opportunities that I will always be grateful for. But the truth is that the reason I had gone there was to save my family. And despite all my efforts, I failed. Professionally, I was progressing. Personally, I felt something important was slipping away. And the biggest turning point came when I thought about my daughter. I realized I was missing key moments that I will never get back. I kept asking myself what success really meant for me. Was it building a career in a city of skyscrapers while watching my daughter grow up from a distance? Or was it being present for the people I love most? Eventually, I made a decision to come back to Kenya. For me, coming home was not about giving up an opportunity. It was about redefining success. It was about choosing purpose, family, and being present for my daughter's life. Looking back, I do not see my migration journey as simply a personal story. I see it as a story of many people living this today. Climate pressures have made livelihoods less secure. Economic opportunities have become harder to find. Families are being forced to make the difficult choices. Migration is the path which is seeming available for many families. And to the businesses, policymakers, recruiters, and organizations on this room, I'm glad. I wish I was there in person. I want to share one quote with you. The people closest to the problem are often closest to the solution. As climate change reshapes livelihoods and drives labor mobility, responsible recruitment must move beyond compliance and genuinely protect workers, amplify frontline voices, and create a more equitable future for all. Thank you.
Thank you, Evans. Thank you so much. Thank you for grounding us in this conversation and taking the time to be here with us. What you've just described, Evans, you know, losing a farm and making a move to a new country, that wasn't really a choice. Rebuilding from scratch, leaving your family, it's one of the most demanding forms of climate adaptation that there is. And the problem that we're seeing in climate adaptation discussions is that the people who live it and who are the most experienced climate adapters, migrant workers, are almost never in the room when adaptation gets designed. And so they carry the consequences first, but they're consulted last very often. And that's really the gap and, you know, the opportunity as well that we want to address in this panel ahead of an in-person workshop that we'll be holding tomorrow for our in-person audience, looking at South Asia climate migration specifically and looking at the different risks along the migration journey from pre-recruitment to return. So we hope that the in-person audience will join us for that. And we'll have some pre-recorded opening remarks from Mary Robinson, who's IHRB's founding chair, And one of the things she says is that climate justice has to include the people already paying the costs, not only the institutions deciding on their behalf. So today we're going to welcome four other excellent panelists. We have Kanta Rigaud online from the World Bank. We have Morny here from Nestle. We have Gertra Lano from IOM, and we have Joseph Malyamov from Tenaganita, a human rights organization here in Malaysia. So I'd like to first start with you, Kanta, giving us a bit of, scene setting and wider picture. You've focused on climate adaptation for a very long time and how climate pressures are reshaping where people can live and where they can stay. And so what do you see in terms of what's changing, in terms of who's forced to move from where, what pressures, climate pressures migrant workers are experiencing, and very importantly, what should companies be anticipating now?
Thank you. Thank you so much, Sarah, for that introduction. And thank you also to Evans, really, for illustrating the issues so compellingly. And I think you've raised a very important set of questions. And before I go into those questions, I thought to put the climate issue into the broader perspective. I think Evans has laid out what it means for an individual and how that anecdote is repeated multiple times. But I just wanted to convey a few messages from the climate perspective, right? We talk about climate change affecting labor migration and migration more broadly, but we know that climate also does not act on its own. It is really, a threat multiplier that acts alongside other issues, whether it's poverty, oftentimes, demographics, where the population is multiplying, and fragility and instability sometimes. But we also know that the science is very clear. The climate impacts, as we see them already, are intensifying and escalating. And that what we found in the work that we've done is that now, in fact, the potency for climate really on its own will likely drive the kind of migration that Evans is talking about much more and intensify that. But it doesn't act in the same way everywhere. Locality matters. And what we think is really important to understand is that context in which it happens, because we find that there are some areas which are the hotspots, and we need to pay attention to those geographic areas where people move out from because of the habitability challenges or the income challenges, but where they also move into. And we need to manage it both, because I think that's where some of the labor migration and the work of the recruitment agencies and governments becomes really important. So at the end of it, I think labor migration will increasingly, if not already, be shaped by climate change. And that at the same time, it can act in a positive way to help communities adapt, as was the case of Evans, recognizing also the challenges there. But it can also help us with the broader climate challenge of facilitating the kind of green transition with the right kind of jobs and skills that labor migration can bring. So I think you've raised a question, that context: how is climate change reshaping it? What are the implications? And how do we act on that from the labor migration actors and perspectives? And I think there are also two other contexts that perhaps are important in understanding climate from the perspective of labor migration, because oftentimes we know that climate adaptation, development planning, and labor migration are all in separate institutions. And how do we deal with that fragmentation? What needs to change? These are issues I'm sure that yourselves as the recruitment agencies deal with all the time. But I think it's the climate then adds an additional dimension. The third is, how do we look ahead, right, to harness those opportunities? So maybe just, I think, to visually convey the complexity, how these drivers of poverty, population growth, climate change all reinforce and force that intertwined drivers of mobility. We see that most poignantly in sometimes in sub-Saharan Africa, in the Sahel, where there's high levels of poverty, population fertility and population growth is high, there's lots of fragility, and then it leads to migration. But climate change, because of the temperature rise that we're talking about, sea level, changes in precipitation patterns, we hear about the heat stresses. Very sadly, even in European countries, in France, we just heard about more than 1,000 people, mortality of 1,000 people due to heat stress. So imagine in more vulnerable areas and where we don't consider those issues. This can lead to income declines, as was illustrated by Evans, and the habitability, sometimes in coastal areas where people are not able to live anymore, oftentimes, for example, in small islands, but also in coastal areas like in West Africa, people are forced to move, and they move both domestically and cross-border. But I think it would be sort of from the climate perspective, we are really sometimes sitting at a crossroad, right? Climate impacts, we all know. We've all heard about heat stresses. We've heard of droughts. We hear of flooding ever so often that happens these days. And we hear of crop losses, as was mentioned by Evans, where farmers are not able to have their crops because of this changing in the seasonality. The rains don't come, or the rain come too early, or the rains come recurrently and with the flooding wash away the crops. So as we sit in this crossroads, ideally, we would like to reduce that greenhouse gas emissions, that yellow line, and move downwards, where the impacts of heat waves or crop losses or flooding, all of which are much more manageable. Unfortunately, the level at which we are emitting we are increasing it. And so we're probably going to face higher levels of heat waves and crop losses and flooding. And with that, I think we will have a higher impact from the nature of climate change, which will affect the kind of labor migration that all of us are talking about. So some years back, the World Bank thought about how do we really understand the scale of this issue and the potency
Kanta, you're just freezing a little bit. Let's give you a minute. Can you still hear us? Evans, can you still hear us?
Yes, I can hear you correctly, but Kanta is breaking.
Okay. We'll just give her a few seconds. Kanta, are you still there?
Yes.
Sorry, you were cutting out a little bit.
Can you hear me?
No, unfortunately, you're freezing, so we can't hear you very well.
Can you hear me, Sarah?
Yes, now we can hear you.
So very quickly then, I think, so the World Bank undertook this study to understand the scale of the issue, who will move and where will they move, and to what extent climate will be a driver. And with that, what we found, let's just stop. Can you see my slides?
Yes.
You see the slides?
Yes, we see them, yeah.
Okay, fine. So I'm going to be brief so I don't get cut off again. When we did this study, we estimated that what was the scale of potential climate-induced migration. And what we found is that by 2050, if we don't do the right kind of policy action, we could have as many as 216 million people moving within their countries, and this doesn't even include the cross-border. What is 216 million? That's the combined population of Thailand, Philippines, and Malaysia as of today. And And yet, at the same time, the largest level of movement will be from sub-Saharan Africa at 86 million. At the same time, though, when you look at a number like North Africa and see 19 million, you may not think that's a lot, but that's 10% of the population. So just to say that no region is immune and that the labor migrant profile is likely to change with an increased supply of potentially migrants from poor and vulnerable countries. And so the recruitment areas will be equally affected by climate change. But as I mentioned, not all areas are equal. So what you see in this map is from between 2030 to 2050, you will have more out migration. This is the red areas. And you will have in migration into the red areas and out migration from the blue areas because the way in which climate acts on the land differs in terms of the crop productivity losses, in terms of water stress, in terms of sea level. And we've only looked at a subset of factors. So we really need to think about climate in that context. But the good news is that we're not locked into this level of migration if we do the right kind of policies. So while we say on the high end, we could have as many as 216 million, with concrete climate and development policies and good adaptation, that number could be reduced as much as 70 to 80%. And that holds for the different regions that we looked at. And the reason that this is important is that the job opportunities and the kind of adaptation policies that we do can make a big difference. And therefore, the labor migrant part of it is equally important. And the way we can act on this climate related mobility is really at three levels. Before people are forced to move out, we heard the story of Evans. If there were better alternatives on the ground, if there was better adaptation, and in some cases, this will still not be sufficient and people would have to move, but there are a lot of kinds of jobs and opportunities. There's a development deficit that really needs to be addressed. But the second is when people have to move, do they have the right kind of support? Are they developing the right kind of skills? Do they have the right kind of ability to move? And also after they move, when they arrive at their new location, if, for example, they were recruited, do they have the right kind of support that they don't necessarily face more of the same risk associated with climate or other vulnerability issues? And this is where I found really the convergence with the DACA principles that IHRB has developed. And really, when I looked at that 10-point plan, I think there are some really important and useful entry points where climate-related mobility could be addressed, particularly in terms of the living conditions for the labor migrants and the working conditions, so that you do not get exposed to the kind of same climate pressures that you actually moved away from, for example, heat stress. So I won't go back into the messages, but I think the messages really amplify that climate is already affecting the scale of mobility and is affecting labor migration, but there are both opportunities and challenges that we can deal with in a constructive manner. So let me stop there, Sarah, and I hope you were able to hear me.
Yes, thank you so much, Kanta, for this very thorough overview of what's coming, these very stark numbers, but also the opportunity that you're reminding us of. If we put the right policies in place, if we put people first in terms of adaptation policies, and because I'd also like to leave some time for a Q&A at the end, I hope there will be a lot of questions from our audience. I'd like to move on to our next speaker, Morni Azmi from Nestle. Yep, welcome.
Thank you.
So you work for a major, global business that sources from some of the world's most climate exposed agricultural regions, that employs large numbers of migrant workers across its supply chains. We heard an example today of farmers losing their land due to drought, like Evan's story. So from inside Nestle, how are you thinking about responsible recruitment, knowing that the people you're hiring may be more affected or are more affected by climate pressures?
Yeah, thank you so much, Sarah. And Kanta I was also reading the World Bank Groundswell report as well, and was studying that, and also from IOM, the IOM SEI report as well. And thank you so much, Evan, for sharing your story. Really appreciate it. So the Groundswell report talks about labor movement within the country. But within Malaysia as well, we are receiving about what's reported between 2.14 million to 2.5 million migrant foreign labor into Malaysia, but in total about 5 million, including of undocumented workers. So very much so for Malaysia, we are receiving migrant workers, not so much observed in terms of movements, but overall globally, we do observe that this is happening as well. Because at Nestle, we source 14 key raw materials from more than 80 countries. So many of them in regions that are already feeling the sharp end of climate stress. Because we also see that the ILO data is clear that sectors with more exposed to the green transition are agriculture, chief in them, are also sectors with the highest concentration of migrant workers. So for us on the ground, what we're seeing is that it's not a sudden break. It is these are an acceleration of patterns that were already there. Yeah. So for example, in cocoa and coffee, as this is one of the key raw materials that Nestle sources, increasingly volatile weather and poor harvest, and what we've heard from Evans as well, are eroding the viability of farming as a livelihood. And we also see already farming, right, is falling often below what is needed for a decent standard of living. So, and recently in our internal assessment that what we've seen in India, for example, subsistence farmers, they are from the north, are starting to move south because they can no longer live off their land and they're going into the commodity supply chains such as sugar. So and then in terms of how I see how this changes what I think about responsible recruitment, and also internally at Nestle, what we see, what changes responsible recruitment is that climate change is not creating a new category of recruitment risk. It's amplifying the risks that were already systemic. And I refer back to what IOM and SEI study was saying, is that especially those moving cross borders, they won't declare themselves as climate refugees, right? But these are one of the reasons, or the risk multiplier that Kanta mentioned just now, that are exacerbating that risk or driving them to move, right? So, and then that is in terms of, country of origin. And how we see responsible recruitment is that not just at the point of signing that contract, of being recruited, is even before, and it's not at that point of hire of compliance exercise. The vulnerability begins before the contract is signed and continues well after, even when they land at the destination country. The living conditions, the working conditions that they are faced, through these climate-driven disruptions, both at origin and at destination, which is ultimately that traps the workers in harmful work. And it is something that we have to look into. And for me, the work is no longer about verifying that moment. It's about understanding that whole arc.
Yeah, thank you, Morni. So it's really the whole journey pre-recruitment that you're taking into account. Exactly. And I think you wanted to show us a slide as well in terms of, if we could, you can go to the next slide.
Yeah, I'll go to the next one. So this is how we do what you're seeing here is in terms of our 5-step HREDD that we're doing. But for us, our core principles, our core standards do not flex. Whatever it is, no worker paid recruitment fees, transparency, freedom of movement, and protection of workers' rights remain non-negotiable throughout our whole supply chain. And this is based on our Nestle's responsible sourcing core requirements and also Nestle's human rights framework. So how we hold it together in this in practice is this 5-step HREDD framework that we have. But in general, it looks like this. The upstream risk mapping and supplier due diligence will happen, not just at our tier 1 suppliers, but it goes further upstream into our millers, refineries, for example, if we look at palm oil, down into the plantations, right? By geography and ingredient with systematic supplier level assessments, audits, and stakeholder engagement. Also, the second part of this whole 5-step is supplier capacity building. Very much so, I've experienced that here locally as well, where we've set up the plan at a global level. And as I'm representing Nestle here in Malaysia, I attend this supplier capacity building that goes beyond our tier 1 suppliers. And also we do recruitment agency engagement, and we have programs and pilots with IOM. And also, you know, what we've been working with CGF, recruitment marketplace, right? Ethical recruitment marketplace, where it's not just the last mile of approach, but that 100-mile journey. And then, of course, it is underpinned and supported by worker voice and grievance mechanisms, you know, operationalized through supplier level systems and collaborative, often sector-wide mechanisms. And also, you know, there's always the Nestle grievance mechanism that we have set up, and it's globally available online in various languages, and it's called the Speak Up. So, but when we look in terms of where the system is honestly being tested, right? So I'm going to be candid about these areas that we are still building, yeah? So we do not currently map specific recruitment corridors end to end. They are highly dynamic because we have 14 raw materials sourced from over 80 countries. And doing so at scale is genuinely difficult for a single company to do, right? So this is where working with partners, collective action is required. We're exploring origin site livelihood interventions to reduce push factors. So this is where building resilience at source or at origin is very important. So that's where we're looking at regenerative agriculture and improving the livelihoods of the farmers at origin. And also, we are integrating climate risk more systematically into due diligence processes, though not specifically tied to recruitment yet. Of course, there are other risks that we're looking into in terms of recruitment, and it is underpinned by this climate change that we're facing right now.
Thank you, Morni. Just a last very quick question, because I'd like us to move to our other panelists as well. So as I explained in the beginning, and this is part of the work that we're developing at IHRB with our Just Transitions program as well, that migrant workers shouldn't just be protected by climate impacts, but also should be part or active participants in the climate adaptation design and solutions, and including in the companies where they're working. So from your point of view, from Nestle's point of view, how do we get there? What does a business have to do for that to become reality?
Yeah, so that's where, as a business, again, it's about building resilience from the point of origin, especially where our supply chains come from, right? So we do have origin programs, and there are such, you know, we look into regenerative agriculture at the point of origin or at the farms or plantations that we have in our various more than 80 countries. So that's where we look at living income accelerator. And one of the examples is a Nescafe plan, whereby farmers and their communities are also supported to make decisions that improve their own resilience. And productivity and income. And locally, even in Malaysia, we have like the Chili Club, where we discuss with the farmers in terms of, and provide capacity building with the farmers in terms of how to improve their crops, new technologies, and things like that. But this is where we also see there is opportunity to move from the farmers to the workers as well, working with the workers in terms of understanding and building that, hearing their voice in terms of how to build resilience and improve their income as well. So, but the hardest thing that businesses will have to do to change, in my view, is that moving from a model that's largely compliance into control-driven that's more participatory and system-oriented. And of course, this is where also locally, you know, with our governments, there's something that we need to look into. And I see so many nodding heads in front as well. And this is where working with social rights group, yeah, that voice that we need to have, right? Collective action together with the groups that we participate in, that we need to come together and see how we can move from just a concept into a reality. Yeah. So I think I'll cut that short.
Yes,
because,
thank
yeah,
you. Thank you so much, Morni. So,
no worries.
Girtra, welcome. You're joining us as a senior regional specialist, labor mobility and social inclusion from the IOM Regional Office for Asia and the Pacific. So you'll be giving us a bit of that lens in terms of what we're seeing around the relationship between climate change and labor mobility. So in terms of how is climate change influencing who's moving from where into which sectors or working conditions, what do you see are the most significant gaps?
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm really happy to be here to discuss this important topic. Now, the advantage of being one of the last speakers is that many things have already been said, so it will be easier to answer your questions. So how does climate change relate to labor mobility? We already heard from Kantar that definitely labor migration is increasingly affected by climate change, but that yet climate change is not a standalone driver, that really acts together with other drivers, socio-economic, such as poverty or debt. And I feel it was very well illustrated also by Evan's story, who said that it is actually not climate change as such that drove migration, but it's the effect that climate change has on people's livelihoods, on people's well-being. And I think that is really what we're looking at. As IOM, we did some research in Thailand and in Malaysia, in palm oil, sugarcane. And what we saw there is when we asked migrant workers, they reported exactly similar stories as Evan, saying that increased drought, floods, reduced yields, and that actually was impacting their income, and that is then what motivated them to migrate. Now, where are the gaps? We know that climate change can be a driver for migration. What we don't know is the details, what, when, how, under which conditions, and that's where more research and more evidence is needed. For example, recruitment modalities, working conditions, sectors, that would really help to get a more comprehensive picture. I also want to link back to what you said about climate change as a risk multiplier, right? We know that climate change can increase vulnerabilities. It can, you know, sharpen those conditions that make migrant workers vulnerable to exploitation, to trafficking, to forced labor. But also there, more research would definitely be useful. That being said, I think we know enough to know that action is needed. And probably that brings us to the next question, Sarah.
Yes, so the next question is, as we see countries move more and more globally towards greener and more climate resilient economies, how can we better integrate labor migration or labor mobility into these just transitions? What are the risks that could be leaving migrant workers behind? You know, especially when we know that those workers affected by climate change have the least access to safe and regular migration pathways?
Yeah, I think for us that's a very important question. How can we better integrate labor migration, migrant protection in the just transition? We know that migrant workers already make an important contribution to the green transition. There are many migrant workers in, for example, the renewable energy sectors or supply chains related to that. So it all comes to this: how can we ensure that migrant workers in those sectors are recruited fairly, that they face decent work conditions, but also that we have the right pathways available so that we don't have to rely on irregular migration or migrant financed migration. That is one point. The second element is that we also have many migrant workers who are working in sectors that are carbon intensive. So they're affected by decarbonisation, they're affected by restructuring. And how do we ensure that those migrant workers are not left behind? Will they have the possibility to change sectors, to change employers? Can they be reskilled, upskilled to work in other sectors? So for all those reasons, there is an important element of making sure labor migration is integrated in climate policies, whether it's national adaptation plans, just transition strategies, or even sectoral decarbonization plans. Now, what are the main gaps here? I think the first one is that currently migrant workers are really invisible in the just transition. And I believe a just transition can't be just if migrant workers are not visible. So this comes back to the fact we need more data, we need more evidence to understand in which sectors, whether it's the green economy or whether it's precisely sectors affected by decarbonization, are migrant workers present and what are the risks they are facing. Secondly, what we also see is in the policies, currently labor migration or protection of migrant workers is not really systematically included in climate policies. And I think it links to something that was said earlier, that we don't even have the migrant worker voice in the just transition debate. Evans, you were very right that the people closest to the problem are closest to the solution. I think that goes as well for the just transition, and we need to see migrant workers as a voice and as, you know, having a stake in the decisions linked to just transition. The last element then, or the main gap, I think, links indeed to protection. I said earlier, we see many migrant workers in sectors linked to the green economy. It doesn't mean that there are no risks in those sectors. Unfortunately, we risk continuing the same problems, the same inequalities if we don't address migrant worker protection in the just transition. I think you gave very good examples there. We all can learn from Nestlé. So all in all, I think the core is we have to see that migrant worker protection goes hand in hand with the just transition.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Geertra. And one last very quick question before I invite Joseph. You know, we have recruiters, we have businesses, governments in the room and online. And what would you tell them in terms of adapting their policies and practices to better anticipate climate climate-related labor mobility and protect migrant workers in these contexts?
Yeah. So the key question indeed is, what does this all mean for responsible recruitment? To me, it means that responsible recruitment must be more climate aware. As we said earlier, climate change is a risk multiplier. As businesses, as recruiters, are we aware of those risks that are there at the origin, how communities are affected by climate change, how that can also lead to, for example, income loss, debt, and how perhaps during recruitment, scrupulous actors may make use of these migration pressures and vulnerabilities. So that is one point. The second point is also looking at migrants at destination, because climate change does not only impact where people move from, it also impacts their conditions upon destination. And I think here, for example, we have to look at contracts, job orders. Are these climate aware? For example, are the working hours realistic? Do migrant workers have access to shade, to water? Is the accommodation safe? But another element could also be wage protection in case climate events prevent or affect work. And then we should, in responsible recruitment, also protect those migrant workers who are in those sectors affected by decarbonization, by restructuring. As I said earlier, if due to climate policy, there are changes in labor market demand, we should make sure that our migrant workers are not left stranded. Is there visa flexibility? Can they change sectors? Can they change employers? That is an important element. And maybe one last thing, I would hope that we can ensure that the green transition is not built on migrant financed migration or migration that leads to debt. So we need more human rights due diligence also in the green economy, in the green industries. And again, thanks to Nestle for taking the lead on that. So these are a few suggestions. If you don't mind, I'll just flash a few resources that we have here. We've done as IOM a lot of work to look at the linkages between climate change and human mobility, including a specific piece that we worked on, a framework to a collaboration that we have with Apple for several years, who wanted us to look precisely how can we strengthen resilience in communities of origin of migrant workers. And then here are those resources that I referred to earlier. The research we did with Stockholm Environment Institute in Malaysia and Thailand, looking at palm oil and sugarcane precisely. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Geertra. So we're ending with Joseph, who's kindly joined us from Tenaganita, which is a Malaysian human rights organization building, assisting, and advocating for migrants, refugees, women, and children. And, you know, we spent the last 45 minutes talking about numbers and policy, and obviously, you know, workers as well, their place in this discussion. And it's very important for us to have your perspective to bring in worker voice again into this conversation. So you work with migrant workers in sectors that are the most affected by climate. What are you hearing in terms of what's happening to these workers on the ground? What do companies in the room need to hear?
Good afternoon. I do not want to repeat what has been said earlier because the last speaker. There are many push factors that make people want to move from their countries to other countries in search of better livelihoods. Climate change is just one of those factors that destroy livelihoods and contribute to the totality of push factors. Now, my focus today will be on the realities faced by these workers who have experienced the push factors, who have been recruited and are here in Malaysia. My presentation will touch upon the main aspects of the migrant journey from their home country to Malaysia. But instead of talking in abstract terms, I prefer to ground my presentation in the real lives of people who are here. And so I'll just tell you a story. I'll tell you the story of Shafiqul, a migrant worker from Bangladesh. Now, Shafiqul's story will illustrate the main aspects of a migrant's journey from his country to ours, and will also illustrate the main aspects of what the migrant experiences from his own perspective. The story is not a fiction. It is it's an actual case from our files. Now, most of the events mentioned in the story happened to him. Some may have happened to others like him, but nevertheless, all those things that I will talk about have been experienced by migrant workers. It is not an isolated story, but something that happens to a large number of migrant workers in the country. Just for context, there are about 2.5 million documented migrant workers in Malaysia, and estimates of undocumented migrant workers range from 1.2 million to 3.5 million. So we can take about 2.5 million as a reasonable figure for the number of undocumented migrant workers in Malaysia. And we should also remember that the majority of undocumented migrant workers, about 2 million of them, are not undocumented by choice, but rather undocumented to circumstances beyond their means. They are victims and survivors of a broken and corruption-ridden system. So let me just go down to the story itself. Now, Shafiqul was a small farmer in Bangladesh. He had a small plot of land, which he worked to support his wife and 3 lovely children. The money was never enough, and he would do odd jobs to supplement his income. 2 of his children were in school. Over the last 3 years, 2 crops failed, driving him deep into debt. And then he decided to try his fortune working abroad. He really did not have a choice. He paid the Malaysian ringgit for 24,000, the equivalent of about 5,000 euro to a manpower recruitment company, to get into the queue of those who are waiting for job opportunities abroad. He had taken a loan from his friendly neighborhood moneylender at a 3% interest per month, or about 36% per year. After waiting for about 6 months, he got his passport, he passed his medical checkup, and completed all the formalities for migration. Then he was told that he had a job in a well-established construction company in Malaysia. And he was given the much anticipated visa with reference, the VDR, or commonly referred to as a calling visa, which would enable him to travel to Malaysia safely with a ready employer waiting for him with a job. He was ecstatic. Now, he was shown an employment contract written in his language at the airport just before boarding the plane, and hurriedly asked to sign the employment contract. He was barely literate, and he had no idea what the employment contract contained. But he was in no mood to ask for clarifications. So he put his signature on the document and gave it back to the agent. He did not even have time to make a copy of the document with his new mobile device. His basic salary would be Malaysian 1,700 ringgit, which is equivalent to about 370 euro. And with at least 60 hours of overtime work, he could earn about 2,500 ringgit per month, which would be about 540 euro. He was told that accommodation would be provided free of charge by his employer. Now, Shafiqul had done his calculations. He thought he could survive on about 500 ringgit a month on a very frugal and tight budget, and setting aside another 100 ringgit for emergencies. He could then have 1,900 ringgit to send home. If he paid 1,000 ringgit monthly towards his loan repayment, it would take him 24 months to repay the principal amount. And meanwhile, his family could survive on the balance of 900 ringgit, which is about, well, I can calculate it in euro. And that would be a tough grind for him, but he was determined to work hard and to do as much overtime work as he could so that he could repay his loan in less than the 2 years that it would take him. And after that, it would be a much better and easier life for him and his family. Now, when Shafiqul arrived in Kuala Lumpur, he was met by an agent of his employer. He cleared the immigration without problems and was taken to a hostel together with 30 others who had arrived with him. The hostel was crowded, poorly ventilated, with limited toilet and bath facilities. But he was assured that it is only a temporary arrangement until much better hostels were completed, which would comply with the government's standards for minimum housing and amenities for workers. The employer's agent collected their passports, which were required to process their work permits within 30 days of arrival. The next day, Shafiqul was all ready and eager to start work, but he was told that he had to wait for his work permit to be issued. In the meanwhile, he was taken for his medical screening again, biometric registration, and to complete all the requirements needed for processing his work permit. As the days passed, Shafiqul was getting anxious. He had hoped to get an advance on his salary so that he could send some money home, but there was no word from the employer. Food supplies provided by the employer's agent dwindled. A month passed. Shafiqul and the others in the hostel were getting desperate. A few of them, unable to wait any longer, had already left the hostel in search of jobs. A week later, the agent came back with their passports, complete with valid work permits for 12 months. The workers were happy, but then there was a small problem, said the agent. The employer had still not got his work order for the contract for the project for which they had been employed. So in other words, there was no job for him. In fact, there never was a job for him because there was no big contract that the employer had. But not to worry, said the agent. You have your passports and a work permit. In a way, you're better off because now you're free to work for whichever employer you choose to. You're not bound to work for the employer named in your permit, which of course was not true. Shafiqul was uneasy. He did not speak Malay, and he had no friends here who could help him to find a job. Some of the others were more confident. Two of them were very happy because they never really intended to work for the employer. They already had job offers from other employers, even before they left Bangladesh, who had promised them much better salaries. And there's much more to be said, but in the interest of time, I will move fast forward to 18 months later. Shafiqul was now undocumented because his work permit had expired. The employer had in fact offered to get his work permit renewed for a fee of 4,000 ringgit. But Shafiqul just could not afford it because he'd hardly worked in the previous year. Now, Shafiqul was not the typical survivor. He was slow in picking up the local language, Malay. It was difficult for him to find jobs. And sometimes, even when he did get a job, he was not paid. He survived mainly on handouts from his countrymen and the occasional odd job that he found. Finally, he was caught up in an immigration raid and he was detained for not having valid documents. In other words, he joined the ranks of the millions of undocumented migrant workers. He was thrown into the detention and depot, and after 6 months, he was deported. Now, a few of the others who had come with him from Bangladesh managed to find jobs in other construction companies. Some of them were detained by immigration officers for working for the wrong employer, that is, not the employer named in their permit. But usually, they were released after the employer settled with the authorities. The settlement fee would be deducted from their salaries over the next few months. But they were not complaining. At least they had jobs which paid a reasonable salary.
Joseph, I'm very sorry, but I'm being told that we have to start
the
next session.
Okay, that's fine. Fine.
I really apologize.
Yes.
Because there's some online speakers that are already here. But, so I'm all my apologies for cutting you off. But as I mentioned, we will be having an in-person workshop tomorrow morning for our in-person attendees. So I hope you'll join us, where we'll continue to explore many of these questions. I'd like to give all of our panelists here and online a big round of applause for bringing